Well, thanks very much for that very kind introduction. I'm really grateful to the Association for International Affairs and for the American Center for this opportunity to talk with you about China's rise and what it means for the United States. I've prepared a handout, and you'll have access to that shortly, which I'll use in lieu of PowerPoints. But my purpose tonight really is to look at this subject, and it's a fairly big subject. And I'm very conflicted myself, because my background, I was a government official for over 30 years. I was a government official. I worked 2/3 of the time for the U.S. Congress. And there I worked in an organization which many of you might know. It's the Congressional Research Service. If you Google it, you can find lots of reports on international affairs and other things from the Congressional Research Service. And there I was a specialist on Asia, and as well as a manager too. And it was very interesting to work there. But one of the things that you find is that as an academic, you talk for 50 minutes on anything. You can talk. It's not a problem. If you work in government, it isn't like that at all. You have to be of service to the member, and in the Congress in particular. But also, I worked in the executive branch as an intelligence officer, and there too, you have to be of service there. And to do that, you have to be very brief. You have to be cogent. And so that's what I'm used to doing, and it's a little sad for me because I find it hard when I speak. I have to speak in little snippets in various ways. I tend to do it, and therefore my meaning doesn't get across. But this is a feature of my training, and to understand it, I think perhaps I'll tell you a story about in Congress. If you're dealing with a member of Congress, and you're dealing with them, you have to be very brief. And we have what we call the 11-second rule, that basically your message has to be done in 11 seconds. Now, why is that? Well, the members are very busy. They come into town in the middle, even when they're in session, they don't arrive in Washington until the middle of the day or late in the day on Tuesday, and they leave in the middle of the day on Thursday. And so, when you are called to give them a briefing or something like that, and I often would be called, it said, the member is going to China tomorrow. He doesn't know anything about China. Come over and tell him about it. And so that would be my job. I would go over and start briefing them about China. And I'd be coming to the office, and the member would be sitting there, and he'd be surrounded by his staffers, and he's signing things and things like this and so forth, and I'm briefing him about Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and things like that, but he's not paying any attention at all. And then the bells ring, and the bells ring mean there's a vote, and so the member says, well, we have to walk and talk. And so that means you go down the hall with the member, and you're going down, and you're trying to brief him Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and so forth, and yet the staffers are all around him, and he has to sign things, and of course he has to know what he's going to vote on. Does he vote yes or does he vote no? You see, so that he's not paying any attention, getting nothing done. And so the trick is, when you get to the escalator, when he comes up to the chamber, you get on the same step. And then you have 11 seconds of his undivided attention. And so, China's rise and its implications for the United States. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. But is China going to dominate Asia? Is China going to be a country that's going to be, are we in a power shift situation? I don't think so. Are we going to have conflict? I don't think so. Is China going to be confronting the United States anytime soon? I don't think so. And that's what I'm going to try to explain today. So that's my 11-second version of what I'm going to talk about today. But now I'm going to give you the academic version, which is 50 minutes, you see, and has the handout, the whole deal here. So we're going to do it that way. I hope that's all right with you. But basically, China's rising, and the United States, I've been doing U.S. China relations for a long time. The United States has differences with China, and they have differences with us. And because of this, when we see China rising, some Americans, like me and others, we say we have to watch this carefully. Is this going to work out for our interest or not? because we have differences. Now, this audience, I'm sure you understand the differences we have with China. Differences of values, differences on economic trade issues, lots of those, and differences on security. You know, there's a lot of concern about East Asia and the security situation there. We've lived through, I guess, 15 to 20 years now of the PLA, the Chinese army, building up its forces in the Taiwan Strait on their side. They've been doing this since 1995 in a very big way. And Americans have been building up their forces in that area to make sure that the Chinese, if there is a problem, that they are able to intervene right away. This is nerve-wracking. At various times, this was nerve-wracking. It's not so bad now because the relationship between the government in Taiwan and the government on the mainland is much better. That's calmed down. But boy, from 1995 until 2008, we were biting our nails periodically throughout this period. Will they or won't they? And that meant, from the American side, we would have to engage with them, with the Chinese. So this is not, we have differences. We have lots of common ground, too. And China's rise gives opportunities for common ground. But lately, I have to say, we're in a competitive environment. Lately, the United States and China are competitors. They're focusing on competition with one another. They have common ground. They talk nicely with one another when and meet in public and so forth. And there are three reasons why this works, why this continues. Number one, both sides benefit from engagement. So they want positive engagement. Number two, both governments are very interdependent with one another. So if they hurt the other side, they're going to hurt themselves. So they're not going to be doing that. And number three, both leaderships are very preoccupied with other problems. You're all aware of Mr. Obama's many problems in world affairs. Well, the Chinese have a lot of problems too. And so that's kept them, so they don't want a problem with one another if they can avoid it. So for these three reasons, pragmatism has generally ruled the way the two sides go about things. But recently we've found that Chinese leaders don't seem to be so preoccupied. They are preoccupied, but they don't act like they are. And they've been a bit expansionistic in the disputed areas that are disputed with Japan and with the Philippines and with Vietnam in the maritime areas around China's rim. And this is a big problem for the United States. And so this is a challenge for the United States, how to deal with that. So that's a serious problem. And it's being dealt with, but it's not going to be resolved anytime soon. And so what I want to look at, even though we have all these problems and we do see common ground, to have a broader view and look at the realities of power and get a sense, is China in a position to confront America? Are we in a power shift situation? So that's what I'm going to focus on today. So if you have the handout, you can look at it. I'll try to make it as clear as I can to you. If you don't have it, don't worry. I try to speak very clearly. And if you have questions, I mean, if you work for Congress, by this time, 3 or 4 people would have interrupted me with questions by this time. The way they do it is that so I'm very used to this, but I would answer their question, and then they would leave the meeting. You see, because they just came to get an answer for a question, you see. So I'm used to this. And in addition, if you're hesitant to ask a question, because you say, gee, you know, the professor, he might think my question isn't very good, a dumb question, and so forth. I've worked for Congress for over 20 years. I've gotten lots of questions. The classic was, we used to have a hotline when the members would call. Normally the questions would come from the staffers, but the members would call and with this hotline. And they would come immediately to the hotline. He said, do you work on Asia? And I said, yeah, I got it. He says, okay, here's a hot one for you. And the member's on there, and he says, I'm not sure you're going to get this, but he says, I've been looking at the globe for 10 minutes. Where the hell is euthanasia? Now, your English has to be pretty good for that, but euthanasia is mercy killing, you see? And so, the right to die and all that sort of thing. So I said, I think you want to talk to the Health and Education Division. You know, I need to refer you to them. So I'm used to questions, so please don't hesitate to ask. Okay, let's look at China's power, though. China has a lot of power. Economically, its growth rate has been averaged 10% for 30 years. 10% a year for 30 years. Amazing growth. Largest manufacturer, largest trader, largest creditor, largest holder of foreign exchange reserves, between $3 and $4 trillion. A second largest economy, and it's going to surpass the United States probably in a few years, 10 years maybe, and it's the second largest recipient of foreign investment. Militarily, China's military has been growing by double-digit amounts for over 20 years. So they're impressive. They've built up, they're the largest military in Asia by far, and they're able to really complicate things for the United States, even over air and sea near China. Now, the U.S. is really good at air and sea. When the U.S. gets in the ground, it has a hard time. But in air and sea, they're really good. But the Chinese are building capabilities to say, you come in here, you're going to have a big problem with us. And they're doing this very well. And they're focused on this. The focus is Taiwan. And it's been the focus for 20 years. Now, you can talk about these other disputes, but the military has been focused on Taiwan. And then politically, with all this economic and military capabilities, they are very influential in political affairs. So they're the largest trader with Africa, so they're very influential with Africa. Largest trader with places like Brazil, very influential politically there. And so in this situation, and looking at America, and Americans are looking at themselves, the world is looking at America, and they see the United States in decline. A lot of people see that. And so they say, oh my goodness, here's China rising, and we're in decline. We need to do something. Now, some people are alarmed, and they say we have to prepare. We have to gird ourselves, Americans, and build ourselves up to confront the Chinese, because they're going to operationalize these differences with us, and we're going to be put under a lot of pressure. And so this encroachment on the East and South China Sea is the leading edge of this sort of thing. So it's time to get ready for this, to struggle. On the other side are those who say it's time to make a deal. Let's do a G2. Let's just cut a deal with China. We'll get out of the way in Asia, and we'll cut a deal. Okay, these are not attractive to Americans. They don't want to fight the Chinese. And we think the Chinese don't want to fight us. But at the same time, they don't want to appease the Chinese either. So what do you do? Well, I think there are other options, because I think the situation isn't so stark and dire. And the reason, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. Why do I think that? And I'm going to explain that, not with the idea of persuading you that I'm right. What I'd like you to do is put it in your own mind. Because if you're looking at broad international affairs, this is the relationship that you've got to factor in. Now, in the Czech Republic, we're far from Asia. But nonetheless, it has an impact on world affairs. And so I want to provide a framework that you can use to figure out this issue yourself. And use my little handout. It'll help you to remember these things. And it may help you in this regard. Okay. The basic thing I'm going to focus on is, why won't China confront the United States now? Why don't we have a power shift in Asia? A lot of people see a power shift in Asia. They see China dominant, the U.S. in decline, and China's taking over Asia. And the U.S. can't do much about it. I don't think this is happening to the extent that people believe, and I don't think the Chinese are capable of making it happen. And this is why I want to make, and this is my explanation. For China to succeed in this kind of leadership role in Asia, they're going to have to get their domestic house in order. And the first reason why they're not going to confront America, it seems to me, is because their domestic situation is very complicated. I don't want to say it's bad, but it's very complicated. The leadership has lots of problems, big ones. First of all, they have a legitimacy deficit. This is important to understand. Their staying in power depends on them meeting the needs of their people, of keeping development going strongly, of having a good record. We all know from looking at our leaders and probably your leaders, they have downtimes. They have times when they're not doing a good job. And people would throw them out, you know, if they're not performing. But they don't do that because they're elected. And because they're elected, they wait till the next election, and then you throw them out. And you have a process for doing this. In China, they don't have the process. It's this one-party system. You're all familiar with that. And so people take to the streets, and they object in various ways. So the regime is always worried about their performance and has to worry about this a lot. And they have things to worry about. Corruption. China is by far not the most corrupt country in the world, but it's very corrupt. And this is not supposed to happen in a place like China. They're supposed to be, communists. They're supposed to be, fair, and you all know about this. And it's not the case. And it's not the case. And so they have a problem with this. There's a reality, and then there's an image, and the image and the reality are different. And it's supposed to be equal, and it's become increasingly unequal in distribution. So the wide income gaps, like the U.S. now, they're basically the same as the U.S. And they're not supposed to be that way. We're not either, but they're by their pronouncements, they're definitely not supposed to be that way. Inside China, there's widespread social turmoil. If you have a complaint in a system like the United States or other places, you get a lawyer, you do the various things to complain against the government. In China, if anything goes wrong, it's usually the government as seen as responsible. And this leads to 100,000 to 200,000 mass demonstrations a year. This is very hard to manage. The Chinese internal security budget, remember I talked about the defense budget, right? 10% growth for 20 years, big budget. The internal security budget is bigger than the defense budget. So there's a very serious concern on their part. And still, it's not completely successful. We have Uyghur separatists going around killing people. We have all sorts of turmoil in China. And yet, so they have a hard time keeping control of it. The biggest strength of China, of course, is their economy. And yet, this is a very highly resource-intensive economy. In 2010, a very responsible Chinese expert said on the record, China uses 4 times the amount of oil to advance its economy a certain level than does the United States. And we all know the United States is very wasteful in how it uses oil. And yet the Chinese is 4 times that level. So enormous resources go into this kind of their economic development. And it has a profound impact on their air environment, the sea, the water, and pollution. Enormous problem in China. And that is a very serious social problem in China. Lots of objections. And then the economic model itself. They're following basically a modified Japanese model, a modified Asian development model. And it reaches a point of diminishing returns. And it's reached that point. And they know that. And they have to change it. And some countries have a hard time doing this. Witness Japan. And so do they want to be like Japan? I don't think so. And so they're trying very hard to change the system. But there are a lot of vested interest in this system. And to change it, you can't just do it in an authoritarian way. We have this image of China as being an authoritarian system. It is. But when orders come down from the center to the localities, they get implemented spottily. It's what my friend calls a fractured authoritarianism. And so to get people to actually do what the center wants them to do is often difficult, requires extraneous efforts in many cases. And so under these circumstances, they have a lot of problems. And to keep track of this and to carry these out, I would argue they preoccupy the Chinese leaders. It's very hard to tell exactly how they think about, the leaders think about this. We don't know how the leaders think about these issues. However, when you add them all up, collectively, they're very impressive, and to me, they seem a serious constraint. China, with all these internal preoccupations, is unlikely to confront the United States, in my judgment. This is one of 3 factors. But I can't give you a precise measure of it. I'm trying to be honest with you. And anybody that does, they're fooling you. They have an opinion, but there's not an agreement on this at all. The second point I would emphasize is that the United States and China, as I already mentioned, are very interdependent. Economically, very interdependent. on a whole range of trade, investment, and other matters. Strategically very interdependent. China needs oil, as we all know, and the main source of the extra oil they need is coming from the Persian Gulf. Which power controls the Persian Gulf? The access to the Persian Gulf, the United States. And it's been that way for a long time, and it hasn't changed in a long time. And China knows that. If they confront the United States, where is their oil going to come from? It's not going to come from this place, and they know that too. This is just one example. China depends on the United States to deal with North Korea. China should be the leader in dealing with North Korean issue, don't you think? Look at the map. It's right there. It's fundamentally central to China. And yet, who is the country that's responsible for dealing with North Korea ultimately? The United States. They need the United States on this one, too. And if you start getting into Taiwan and other issues, the U.S. can cause China lots of problems. And so they definitely are dependent on the United States on a lot of different ways to be helpful and not to be hurtful vis-a-vis China. Both of these things are hard to measure precisely. How much do they feel about this second issue of interdependence? Again, we don't know. How serious are these internal issues? Very serious. How serious do they perceive them? We don't know that. But there's a third area where we can actually measure. And this is China in Asia. And this is what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about tonight, is China's position in Asia. Because they have lots of insecurities here. And the insecurities here, and this is striking. Let me just preface this by mentioning Asia is the focus of Chinese foreign relations. The rim of Asia, all around China. The rim of China, all around in Asia. This is the area that gets about 70% of Chinese foreign policy attention. And there are good reasons for this. When you look at China's relations with Europe, this country and other countries in Europe, what are they concerned about? Pretty much the same thing they're concerned about, in roughly speaking, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Africa. In those areas, it's heavily commercial. They want these countries, they want to use and interact with these countries in ways that are helpful to their economy. They can sell things to these countries, maybe buy things, invest in things, this kind of thing. They want an environment where they can do that. Make money, help China's economy grow, which is very important for them. These areas don't have these sovereignty issues that they have all around the rim of China, particularly the maritime rim. And they don't have security issues for China, whereas they do have security issues for China around the rim of China. Meanwhile, these areas, the East Asian area, the Asian areas around China are very important for Chinese development. If they're not stable, then Chinese development won't progress. And if Chinese development doesn't progress smoothly, the leaders in China are in some jeopardy. This is very important for their legitimacy. And these countries are really more important for China economically than you might imagine. You all know that China is the largest trader with Africa, right? Over $200 billion a year of trade with Africa. They do more trade with South Korea than they do with all of Africa. And so this area is really a fundamental point. And finally, this is where they meet the superpower. This is where the United States and China really meet in ways that matter. Other issues matter, like nuclear issues and climate change and things like that. But at the end of the day, the key sensitive issues between us are heavily focused on the Asian area. Okay. So I've underlined why this is very important for China. Then I say, okay, well, if they're not secure in Asia, they're not dominant in Asia, will they be confrontational with America? I don't think so. So what is their position in Asia? How powerful are they there? And when you look at it, it's surprising. They put an awful lot of effort into working with Asia, and yet their position is mediocre. Their influence is mediocre. And let me try to explain. I try to explain that in two ways in my presentation. And this will give you a way to do it yourself. Now, the first way is just to look at China's rise in Asia since the Cold War. And what we see is that China's encumbered. They're encumbered because during the Cold War, their record in Asia was terrible. They were the most disruptive element in Asia from 1949 until 1989. And the countries all around China's rim know this. Nobody talks about this anymore. And so I've gotten this information mainly through interviews with government officials, 10 different Asian Pacific countries over the last 10 years I've been doing this. I've talked with them and got their viewpoints on these kinds of issues. But the record is very clear. And what does it mean? These countries around China all have a legacy of wariness toward China. And you say, well, you might be, I give this talk in China periodically, and people will look at me in a very puzzled way when I say something like this, that China was the most disruptive element in Asia. Because they've never, and it's students in particular, they've never heard of it. They have no idea what I'm talking about. And so I have to go through, I said, does anybody here remember the Khmer Rouge? Now maybe you don't remember the Khmer Rouge. They were a genocidal group in Cambodia. And they were opposed to the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese were backed by the Soviet Union, and so China backed the Khmer Rouge, even though they were genocidal. Why? Because they were against the Vietnamese who were backed by the Soviet Union. Doesn't matter. And the Chinese were with them every step of the way. This is called ruthless. The ruthless pursuit of your interest. That was done by Mao, but it was done by Deng Xiaoping. Mr. Pragmatism. And he was pragmatic. They were good fighters. And the Chinese did the same thing in various ways with the countries all around their rim. Now, a lot of these countries were aligned with the United States, so this was against the United States and indirectly. But the most neutral of all the Southeast Asian countries, Burma, was subjected to the biggest insurgency. Why? Because China didn't like Burma. Okay, so this kind of thing happened for 40 years. So that's a legacy that makes the neighbors a bit wary. Following that, the Chinese have followed a policy of peaceful rise, peaceful coexistence, and peace and development, using economics mainly to get along with the neighbors. And it works very, very well. It's a good policy. When they've stuck to it, but they have a hard time sticking to it. This is the problem. They're conflicted. On the one hand, they definitely want to get along with the neighbors. They want to have win-win cooperation with these neighbors on an economic plane, and the neighbors want that with China. They don't want trouble with China. They want to get along with China. They want to prosper with China. They want to have common ground, all that sort of stuff. Everybody wants that. So that's good. That's really good. But then the Chinese at the same time have these security and sovereignty problems. And when they get into the sovereignty issues in particular, they're just uncompromising. Totally uncompromising. And they're very rigid in how they deal with these issues. And when it becomes a sensitive issue, they just resort to whatever they need to resort to, and sometimes it's very coercive to get what they want. And they don't do this consistently. It's episodic. It's been episodic. But it will happen in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, at various times, and has over the various years. And we're in the middle of a big phase now, where they've put a lot of emphasis on their territorial claims. They've fostered an attitude in their countries that's very nationalistic on these kinds of issues. And so it's very, very difficult to compromise. This is part of the negative legacy that China has, is that they've created a way of thinking on the part of people of China which makes compromise is very difficult. Did you know that the People's Republic of China has never acknowledged making a mistake in foreign affairs? Never. And so what does this mean? If you have a difference with another party, well, the fault is never China's. And so the fault has to be with the other party. Well, sometimes they like the other party and say, well, it's really not your fault. But they have to blame somebody. So who do they blame? The good old U.S. of A., you see? It must be containment, on the part of America. And so this is a very, but this is a problem when you're dealing with these differences, because it makes it very difficult to come to a compromise. I'm a devout Roman Catholic, and there's only one other institution I know of that's like this, that has great difficulty acknowledging their mistakes. And so it's very hard to reform something like that. Mindset is really tough to do. Okay, now, but the way you can, okay, so they have a poor legacy, they have a conflicted approach to the region, which makes it difficult to make successful approaches. But the thing that you can do yourself is say, they've been working for 25 years to improve their relationships with Asia. How are they doing? Measure. There are 3 other powers, big powers in Asia: Japan, India, and Russia. Japan, how are they doing? Worst ever. Worst ever. Disaster in relationships right now. Confrontational, very, very negative. India. India is emblematic of what you see throughout Asia with China. That is, they want to get along with China. They recognize the need to get along with China. They want to have economic progress with China. All of this is very true. But at the same time, they remain very wary of China because of differences. India has territorial disputes with China. China supports Pakistan. There's a whole list of problems that they have. And so the Indians are wary of China. And they're worried about rising China in a way that might coerce them in some way. And so they look for closer support from other places, including the United States. This is a very common pattern that you'll see in the Asia-Pacific. And just a summary here, India's relations with China, India's attitudes toward China today and their relations today are worse overall than they were 10 years ago. Russia, it's better. This is probably the best time in Russia-China relations in the post-Cold War period. It's probably the closest now. Is it good? A country like the Czech Republic understands Russia pretty well. What do you think? This is an expedient business. China's win-win formula is expedient. They say, well, we cooperate where it's in our interest, and we don't cooperate when it's not. And they shift and their interests shift. And the Russian interests shift all the time in certain ways. Their approaches, their tactics shift. And so at least 2 occasions, they've really disappointed one another in their dealing with the West and so forth. But right now, it's good relations right now. Middle powers. Middle powers like I mentioned South Korea. South Korea depends on China's market. More than 20% of South Korean trade goes to China. Very close economic relations. And they were very close in a lot of other ways, too. I visited and interviewed in South Korea in several times, but in 2004, and the relationships were very close. And then they're not, because the Chinese support North Korea. And in 2010, the North Koreans were beginning in the midst of a leadership succession, and they were very violent towards South Korea. Killed a lot of South Korean sailors and soldiers. And the South Koreans wanted to bring this to the UN, and the Chinese blocked it. And the South Koreans said, well, wait a minute. And they started looking at China in a lot of different ways, and they're very suspicious of China. What does China want? China doesn't seem to want unification of South Korea and North Korea with South Korea in charge. And there are lots of other differences as well. And so we have a wariness on the part of South Korea. Australia, another big middle power that has very close economic relations with China. More than 20% of their exports go to China. And in 2004, they had a wonderful attitude toward China. Today, it's very different. The Chinese military is a big concern to the Australians, and what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea, another big concern. Indonesia, another middle power. Indonesia has a very checkered relationship in the past with China, very negative in many respects. But the Chinese worked very hard to improve relations. Their peaceful development emphasis was really encouraging to the Indonesians, and relations were moving along really, really well until 2012 and the Chinese more assertive, coercive policies in the South China Sea. Now the Indonesians are on guard. And they want to talk more to the United States and other countries. So you see from the middle power, and we can go through the whole range of countries here, who is China's close partner? The only ally is North Korea. With friends like that, you're in trouble. And so the upshot here is that you can measure this yourself. Are they secure in Asia? And I would argue, no. They're not secure at all. And they have a lot of work to do to improve their relationships. If I had to look at the situation today, I would say the most important area along the rim is along the maritime rim. This is the area that's very vital to China. First, North Korea. Do they have an answer to that problem? No. It's festering. Japan, confrontational position with Japan, and Japan isn't giving in at all. And then the South China Sea, a softer approach, a softer target. They can intimidate South China Sea countries. You know, they're not that big. They try, but yet Vietnam is pretty tough to intimidate. America learned that a long time ago. And so this is and then you have Taiwan. I mentioned that Taiwan, how important it is for China, and how sensitive it is from a military point of view. But it's been politically in good shape because the government in Taiwan and China are working together. And the government of Taiwan is basically accommodating. However, this government is unpopular. And they lost big elections at the end of last year, and a year from today, they will have presidential elections. And it's likely that the government will lose. And the opposition is very different. And they're very suspicious of China. And that could cause a big problem for China as well. And then you have the issues in Hong Kong, which are now subsided, the umbrella revolution. And that's an uncertainty for China, how to deal with that. So I just don't see them in a very good position measuring, just looking at their capabilities. Another way to measure this, which I'd like to do, is to look at China's strengths and China's limitations in Asia. And then compare it to America. Because I think if we're thinking of a power shift, you're thinking China's ready to confront the United States and take over power, then you have to look at the relative power and influence of these countries, of these two countries. So China's strengths gets a lot of attention. Trade, biggest trader in Asia for many of these countries. Investment is quite important. Asian investment into China more than Chinese investment into Asia, but it's still very important. And then along the rim of China, in Central Asia and in Southeast Asia, the continental rim, you have lots of rail connections, electric grids, roads, and so forth, integrating China very closely with these various countries. So all of these things are important economic connections. Diplomacy, the Chinese are very attentive in their diplomacy in bilateral relations and with multilateral groups, which are very important in Asia, as you know. And then their military is very powerful. Now this runs against their political message, which is peace and development, but the military is a source of great influence for China. And then they have some cultural influence, and there are lots of ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia. And these people tend to be inclined to be more supportive of Beijing, not always, but often. What are Chinese limitations? I've already talked about the legacy. Patriotism. Patriotism, of course, is a strength, but it's a weakness too. Because patriotism means that if you have a dispute with a neighbor, you're very patriotic, the country's very patriotic, it's very difficult to deal with it. Unfortunately, most of the other countries in Asia are very patriotic too. And so you have these conflicts constantly going on, particularly over territory. Military expansion puts all these countries on, many of these countries on guard. India, Australia, South Korea, many others see the Chinese military expansion as in a negative light. And then on trade, China being the biggest trader is very important. It's very important to understand how interdependent this trading is. It relies a lot on foreign invested enterprises in China. It relies a lot on what we call processing trade, where the components go back across borders, and then they're put together, usually in China, and then exported. And so about 38% of Chinese foreign trade is that kind of trade. And so and it's dependent on the market. So who buys this stuff? Well, the Singapore ambassador said about ASEAN-China trade. ASEAN is the 10 countries of Southeast Asia and China. He said of that trade, most of the trade results in manufacturers, and over 60% of those manufacturers are sent out of China and ASEAN. They go somewhere else. They go to Japan, they go to Europe, and they go to the United States. And only 22% stay in the region. So it's dependent. It's a very dependent type of foreign trade system, which I think undermines perhaps the influence, the power of it, the leverage that comes from it, although trade remains very important. But it's a limitation. The Chinese investment is growing in Asia, but it's still not that high. There's a lot of discussion now of new investment that's going to happen. I think that's probably likely. But again, it's starting from a relatively low base. There's a lot more Asian investment into China than the other way around. China doesn't provide much assistance, foreign assistance to Asia. And then in foreign policy, on diplomacy and dealing with other countries, the Chinese attentiveness is on a win-win basis. That means China cooperates and does things with other countries where China wins. They want the other country to win too, but they have to win. And their win set is defined fairly narrowly. It's usually about something about Chinese development and so forth, supporting the government in some way. And so they don't do things like risk or things that cost things that will never be paid back. They're not going to do that. That's not their mode of operations. And so it's a fairly narrow type of thing. It's not unusual. Most countries are like this. My friends in China call this a small country mentality. You see, so now Czech Republic is a smaller country. Maybe you have this mentality. I don't know. But anyway, it's something that I hope you understand. Now, the U.S. limitations. U.S. limitations are well known, get a lot of publicity. First limitation in recent years was George Bush. Maybe some of you remember him. He followed policies that a lot of people didn't like very much, and that was true in Asia too, just like it was in Europe. And so that's a big problem. Mr. Obama is trying to fix that, but he has other problems. The Asian countries tend to like that, his fixing. They like his rebalance. They like his attentiveness to Asia. They like his approaches in various ways, but they don't think he can keep it up. They think that the Americans are in decline, that the budget constraints will force him to cut back. He'll be distracted by Ukraine and by Syria and Iraq, and America will let them down. Obama's saying, no, I won't. And he's maintained his commitments the way he said he would. So we have to wait to see on that. So that's something, that's your homework. You have to watch that. That really will be very important. Will America really decline? Not do. What did it say? Will the rebalance be a sham rather than a real, can you wait till later, or would it be good to clarify it now? Or you might leave asking your question, that's what I'm afraid. Yeah, is that okay? Yes. Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so those are the weaknesses. What are U.S. strengths? This is really important to understand, it seems to me, and because it's not written about. Doing my research, I found very few people writing about U.S. strengths in Asia. I found out by talking to these government officials. Now, most of these government officials were people like I used to be. Sort of mid-level people. They're not the deciders, but they knew what was happening, what was going on. And so I asked them, about these kinds of issues. And it goes like this, really. There are two foundations of American leadership in Asia. And the first is security. In Asia, governments matter. You don't have failed states. And the media is influential to some degree. Public opinion is influential. But at the end of the day, it's these government officials that make decisions. And they're very calculating. And they're looking out for their country's interest as they see it. And what do they see as what's their fundamental concern? Development. They need development. That's their legitimacy rests on development. If they're authoritarian, if they're liberal politically, it doesn't matter. Develop. And I say, well, what do you need for development? And a lot of things. But they say, but basically, I said, they need stability. They can't develop if there's not stability. And I said, okay, well, what about stability? Is Asia stable? And they look at me and they say, well, it looks stable, but it's not really stable. And I said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, we go to these Asian meetings and we dress up and we put funny shirts on and smile a lot with one another, but we really don't like each other. And we certainly don't trust each other. Now this is, I don't want to overgeneralize this, but I think this is true. And it's not just true between China and Japan. You see that publicly with them. Or even Japan and South Korea. You see it throughout Southeast Asia. There's a tremendous wariness on the part of these governments toward one another. I say, well, you need stability for development. Where do you get it? And they look at me as an old American, and they say, there's this big country, and it's far away. And for some reason, this country is willing to spend $50 to $100 billion a year to keep stability in Asia. That's a cost that's not coming back. That's a cost. And its young people are willing to get killed if necessary as they sign up in their military to come to Asia to keep stability in Asia. That's a cost. And they look at me and they say, no one else will do this. And we need it. Watch that. If we don't do that, these officials will recalibrate. But right now, the U.S. does that. That's absolutely fundamental. There's nothing else like it. And it's been developing and established for decades. And so the U.S. military is just all over Asia. The U.S. security apparatus, intelligence apparatus, and so forth is throughout the Asian region, everywhere, including China. But it's very active in all these other countries too. Not North Korea, and not Myanmar yet. But that'll come very soon, I assume. And so this is the most important element. The second element has to do with economics. Most of these countries are economically oriented economies, and they want to, they look for places where their goods are sold. And they're aware that this intra-Asian trade is very interdependent with world markets. And they definitely want to see the United States remain open as a market. The U.S. trade deficit with Asia as a whole is over $400 billion a year, the deficit. And they need that. That's a cost. And the U.S., for various reasons, is willing to do it. Mr. Obama is saying, I'm not going to be protectionist. He's moving in the other direction. He's moving in the direction of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. He wants to open markets even more, a more liberal trade regime. He thinks the United States will benefit from that. So the Americans do these things not because they love Asia. They do this because of their mindset, the sense that this is important to them, the sense that the situation in Asia is very important for the overall security and prosperity of the United States. And therefore, it's in our interest to do this. And they do it. But they may not. They may stop. And that's what the Asians are watching. Will they stop? So the other restraints the United States has in dealing with Asia, which I think are important, is, again, the military connections that I mentioned, and the security connections, intelligence connections throughout the region. And then the fact that the United States non-governmental sector is sort of unique. I don't know of any country that does so many things in world affairs in the non-governmental way. Americans do this all the time. And so in Asia is no exception. And we have a whole array of interaction with Asia that's been going on for decades, if not centuries, that deals with business, the media, foundations, religious institutions, and other types of organizations, and education. And my university has all sorts of activities dealing with Asia. We don't talk to the government about this. We just do it. And these things are very positive. And so the foundation of American relationships with Asia, I think, is very, very positive in that direction. And one final point, America is changing as a society, changing dramatically. The United States was racist for a long time. And race is being raised as an issue in the United States today. And I've seen a lot that's gone on. And I've seen Mr. Obama comment on this. I think he has it right. It's better than it was. It's not great, but it's better than it was. I thought it was a great accomplishment. We elected an African-American president. I said, wow, we passed that milestone. That's a real milestone. But for Asia, what this meant is that in 1965, in the civil rights legislation, period, we passed, and good old Mr. Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson, we passed a colorblind immigration policy. And what happened? Millions of Asians have come to the United States. And they've settled down in the United States. Now, being an immigrant, if you're an immigrant in the United States, it's tough. I've worked with immigrants for 30 years in the United States. It's not fun to be an immigrant any place. I think it's probably better in the United States than a lot of places, but it's not great. Everybody knows that. Dislocating and so. But they fit in, and the younger people get married, they settle down, their kids go to school in the United States, and these are these terrible public schools you've been hearing about in the United States, bad test scores and all that. They do a terrific job of taking these kids and making them mainstream. And so they become a part of our society, and it's usually positive. Sometimes they join gangs, but it's usually positive. And so the result is that we have this web of relationship. Final point I would make on the situation in Asia is that the governments in Asia are hedging. They're looking at this situation, calculating all the time. And at the end of the day, what they see, the rebalance policy of Obama promises them benefits and doesn't give them cost. China promises benefits, economic benefits and many other things, but there's a cost. China says, now we're concerned about these territorial issues. You back away from your territorial claims, or else. And that means territory. Of course, well, let's say you're Thailand. That doesn't matter for you, right? Because they don't have a dispute with you. They might have a dispute about something else. And so the worry in Asia is, what do we do about this? And in this hedging atmosphere, they find the U.S. very attractive to partner with, often quietly, often without the sense that they really like the United States. They certainly don't vote with the United States in the UN and other things, but they do partner this way. And so when I look out, I see the situation. We do have problems with China in the East and South China Sea right now. We don't know how to get them to stop their coercive expansion there. The expansion, of course, has been not military. They're very careful to avoid this. This has been Coast Guard forces and all economic sanctions and threats and different times, but no use of military force yet. It's in the background, not in the foreground. So right now, that's the situation we face, and I'm not sure what the Obama government is going to do. My sense is they're pretty committed to keeping on good terms with China. They will finesse these differences somehow. They object to them strongly. And if the Chinese approaches continue, they continue what we call salami slicing in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, I think then the Americans will have to change their policy. But for now, I think they're sticking with this positive engagement for the three reasons I mentioned earlier. And I think this is likely to continue. But do I think that China is in a position to confront America? No. Do I think that Obama wants to confront China or will try to confront China? Absolutely not. So I think it's okay. We have lots of differences with China, but I think we can manage them in a way that will not lead to conflict. And so the competitive aspects of the relationship in Asia are very important for the U.S. and China. How much impact this will have on the Czech Republic, I don't think it'll have a big impact. I don't think the Americans will come to the Czech Republic and say, we want you to lie with us in the East China Sea and the South China Sea or something like that. No, I don't think so. But there may be issues. I mean, the Chinese have some economic initiatives that seem to undermine the World Bank and particularly the Asian Development Bank and the Internet and maybe the IMF. And we might talk to all European countries about that. But at the end of the day, I think this is pretty much focused on Asia. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to answer questions.